Thank you all very much for coming. This is the talk, Security Not by Chance, the AltusMetrum Hardware Random Number Generator. I'm Tom Marble, and some of you may know me. I want to say it's great to be back at DebConf. I missed last year, unfortunately. I'm really happy to be back. Informatique is my company, and today I'm going to talk about random number generation. In fact, specifically a project that we're calling USB TRNG. TRNG for true random number generation. So these are the things that I want to talk to you about today, give you a sense of what we're thinking. First of all, why do we care? Why do we care about randomness? What's the point? How does this apply to GNU Linux? A little bit about the design that we've got with AltusMetrum for this hardware random number generator, ways that we can measure its quality and effectiveness, and then think about where we're going, where the next steps could be, and that's where we're hoping to get some good questions from you and get some good feedback. For those of you that may be on the stream, you can join us at DebConf-room 329, and hopefully somebody's on IRC and keeping an eye on questions that might come in. We're glad to take those, and I just want to shout out to the Debian video team. I think it's really awesome that we can live stream all of the talks. So why do we care? Random numbers are actually a really important component of security. Random numbers are used to make encryption keys. You may have noticed when you generate your GPG key, it takes a while because the system needs to have enough entropy to create a random key for you. More frequently, whenever you use SSL, you go to a HTTPS website, there is a unique session key that is created between your browser and the server, which is used to encrypt the session using a traditional cipher. But that password, that session key, is actually coming from the random number generator, and if we can guess what it is, that's going to compromise security. And of course, randomness is used in a lot of other places in the kernel and elsewhere for security applications. So it actually ends up being an important element of security overall. And I think that we all know that security is becoming increasingly important in everything that we do. Just a little bit of background on random number generation. Typically, there are two different kinds that we need to talk about, or talk about how TRNG is different from PRNG. PRNG refers to pseudo-random number generators, which are basically varieties of algorithms that take a certain seed or input and then have a formula for generating a sequence of bits which, to as much of a statistical measure as possible, appear like they're random. But they're not actually random. If I start a PRNG with the exact same seed, I will get the exact same sequence of numbers out of it. Sometimes that's really helpful. For example, if you're testing software and you want to test different elements of software, you may want to have something that is sort of random, but that a regression test can catch any changes in the output. In that case, a PRNG is perfect for that. You might argue that there are other kinds of testing that would be a little bit more dynamic, like generative testing or property-based testing, which might be better. But there are some good uses for PRNGs, and in particular, they're fast. So we can get a number, reasonably random number from a PRNG quite quickly. Getting true entropy or randomness requires a hardware random number generator, because what we're really looking for is to get randomness that's based on some physical process, some Brownian motion, some source of variability that is not at all deterministic, that could not be anticipated or guessed by any other means. Many of you may be familiar with dev-random in the Linux kernel, which will block until the kernel has made an assessment that there's actually enough entropy to release more bits. So what are the risks involved with random numbers? As I mentioned, session keys are encrypted with or created with random numbers often. So the significance of this is, even if we have a fantastic public key infrastructure and RSA keys, instead of having to break an RSA key, a 4K RSA key, if all someone has to do is guess your session key, they could decrypt your traffic potentially. So again, as you all know, security is often dominated by the weakest possible link, and what we're doing here is we're trying to shore up the randomness as one of the potential vulnerabilities in our security. So there was an interesting post by Greg K.H. earlier this year, which is pointing to a blog post by Thomas Huden about myths about urandom. And this is important because if Greg K.H. says something, people are going to pay attention and they're going to listen. So in this blog post, Huden is talking about how people are rallying against dev-urandom, which is the pseudo-random number generator, if you will, in the kernel. It's often used in many Linux applications because it does not block. It's often seeded from dev-random, but is actually a sequence of pseudo-random numbers that are provided for you for the kernel. It doesn't block. It's very fast. The downside is it has all of the downsides that could come with a pseudo-random number. And so people were debating about, the differences between dev-random, which blocks until the kernel makes a determination there's enough entropy or not. So it's a very interesting post, and there are a lot of good points that come out on it. But the thing I want to tell you, or the thing you should take away, is that the entire argument is predicated on this one comment, and that is that the outcome or the security is depending upon having enough randomness or entropy at the beginning. Maybe 256 bits is enough. So let's think about that. Do we know that we have enough randomness at the beginning? What if we don't? What if we don't have enough randomness in the beginning? I want to share with you an interesting research paper from the University of Michigan and other sources. Henniger have a great paper on weaknesses in security specifically due to weaknesses in randomness. This is specifically talking about the weaknesses of dev-urandom. And in this paper, they talk about the existence of a boot time entropy hole that leaves systems vulnerable, especially in headless and embedded devices. So let's think about all the servers that are running web services on the web that you maintain probably fall into this category, especially if they're in the cloud. I won't go into all the details of this paper. It's really interesting. I'd highly recommend that you read it. And I will make my slides available so you don't have to jot down URLs or anything. In the paper, they examine over 10 million sites, and they found, by just doing simple scanning, that there were a lot of duplicates in keys that were available on the net. And the short takeaway is that there are many keys that they found to be vulnerable due to a lack of randomness, and this includes SSH keys and RSA keys. So this is the picture that I want to show you. This is the entropy loophole. In this example, in this graph, what you see is time from boot, going from 0 to 70 seconds, and you have different events that are happening. This line here is the actual entropy that is being collected by the kernel in dev-random. This line here is 192 bits. The kernel will not release bits out of dev-random until there's this threshold of randomness. This crossing of the threshold happens in this study at 66 seconds. But let's look at what happens before 66 seconds after boot. This dotted line is the amount of bytes that are coming out of dev-urandom since boot, the pseudo-random number generator. And the event that you should really care about happens here at 4 seconds. What happens then? SSH uses dev-urandom to seed its own internal key generation. So what this means is that SSH doesn't actually have enough entropy at 4 seconds to have a completely unpredictable set of keys. So this is a concern. I wanted to put this note in here, and this is mainly for when you review the slides later. This paper is interesting because what it says is the kernel's estimate of entropy is actually fairly conservative, and it's pretty good. So we can use that. But this problem of random number generation in security has been discussed quite a bit. At South by Southwest, Edward Snowden made this comment, which was picked up by Matthew Green, who you might know as a cryptography researcher at Johns Hopkins. And after this tweet, Green goes on to make a blog post, and I have the URL. Don't try to write it down. You can get it from the slides. How do you know if a random number generator is working? And it's a great blog post because it highlights a lot of the challenges that we've got in security related to random numbers. One of the things that I learned, which I thought was interesting, is that Intel's Ivy Bridge randomness actually gives you bits that are the output of a pseudo-random number generation process, not the entropy directly. So there's a concern about that, but what Green does is he talks about statistical tests that we can use to measure if something is actually random enough. It's a very hard problem. Related to this, and in a separate blog post, Green also talks about something I'm sure you're familiar with, those of you that are in security, is the use of the dual ECDRBG random number generator that has became a NIST proposal. For those that aren't familiar, this was an elliptic curve-based random number generator that was proposed by NIST as a standard and found to have potential backdoors based on the way elliptic curves work. And curiously, the NSA paid RSA Security $1 million to make DC dual ECDRBG the default RNG in all of RSA security products. So this at least should raise a question in our minds about the cipher suites and the random number generators in particular that we're using when we're generating security-related material. So now, after hearing this, would you like some entropy? Yeah. Well, we've got some challenges with TRNGs. They can be expensive. They can be out of stock. They can be based on closed designs. Many of you, I know, are aware of the Symtec entropy key, and this is one of the early places that I went to. Yeah, right.
Sorry.
Well, so I mean, I had to put this. This is on the website, so I had to put this up. That we don't have any in stock, and we don't know when we'll have more.
I actually have about 4, but you can't have them.
Well, that's the problem. So that's why we're here. And I don't know if Nibe is here in the audience. There he is. But he contacted me and let me know that he's working on a project. Maybe he can say some words about his RNG later. But there's a nice website there. Not all in Japanese. So there's some stuff in English there too. And a very important, Maitland called to my attention that at LCA, I believe it was earlier this year.
I think it was at least a year ago.
Maybe it was a year ago. So maybe I've got the year wrong.
No, it was this year. It was this year? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. There was a discussion of RTL entropy, which is really interesting, using a DVB dongle with software-defined radio to use radio as a source of entropy. And so I think it's an interesting approach, and one of the things that I said in talking with my friends about this is that one thing that we could do and should do is when we have good sources of randomness that we can really trust, we ought to have secure ways of mixing the sources together, because that actually makes the quality of the randomness increase. And there are cryptographic ways of doing that. It's fairly straightforward. So do we want more entropy? Yes, we do. So why do we want to go and make yet another hardware product? Well, because it's fun. Because we can. So I was thinking about this and thinking, who do I know that does hardware and software and believes in freedom? So I was thinking of our friends at AltusMetrum that do some really cool hardware designs, open hardware designs with free software, and fly them in rockets. And they actually got me excited in doing this, and I'm going to be flying this in a rocket this weekend. So I'm very excited about it. And so I talked to my friends at AltusMetrum and then learned that, they have actually a lot of experience in this. I tried to count, and I don't know exactly how many open hardware designs there are, but at least over 15 on many different architectures, and a marvelously free real-time operating system with some really neat features that's actually very easy to understand and program. So let me introduce to you B. Del Garby and Keith Packard. We're my friends at AltusMetrum, and that I'm partnering with to do USB TRNG. So a little bit about the design. I'd say NXP Cortex M0, typical USB key, based on a bandgap voltage reference, does noise amplification, and we can have BDL maybe say a few more words about the design at some point. It's boring. This didn't show up so well. This is the schematic, which is all available on the AltusMetrum website, and this is the interesting part with the diode and the op amps and stuff and going in. The rest is classic.
Is that only one noise generator?
The first prototype, is this on? Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. The first hardware prototype has a single noise generator, and it is afflicted with low frequency noise injected through the power supply that needs to be dealt with, which is part of the reason I'm not like handing out samples to folks to play with this weekend. There was a point in history where we thought the right thing to do is to arrive with enough of these to just hand them out to everybody, but life intruded. That's the interesting bit. It's also the part I'm not happy with yet, so there will be more work. You guys know a lot about this problem, and
Talk about how we solved it.
I would love to have that conversation.
That'd be wonderful.
The only...
Give you the schematic.
Brilliant.
We
Yeah.
No video or anything.
Yeah. So the only thing I'll claim to have done that's at all novel in here is the choice of the quote unquote Zener device. There's some interesting parts out now that are actually bandgap voltage references, and
You can get away with a high HFE transistor.
yes, I know
That
they're
works much better.
okay. Well, let's have a conversation about that. I would love to improve that part of it. And as I say, what we have right now, which Tom's going to show in just a moment, are what I would affectionately refer to as version 0.1, protos.
Beta.
No, they're not beta.
They're not beta. Well, so one of the nice things about having open hardware is you can go and grab things like, the PC board design. So this is, just a quick snapshot of the PC board design, which I wanted to have that image in mind of the front, the front and the back of the part, so that when I show you the picture of version 0.1, you would sort of see that it sort of lines up. You've got all the cool bits there, and you've got the nice logo here and the version 0.1 there. And that's what it looks like. It's a little USB key that you plug into your computer and gives you good random numbers.
It's too small.
Too small. Early prototype. So what's cool about this, for all of you, I don't need to belabor this point, but it's based on free software and open hardware using licenses that you're very familiar with. You know why. It facilitates community collaboration and enables independent implementation and discussion, which is actually the part of the reason that we're here, because this security, I think, is very much in need of free software. And I don't think we can get to really good security without freedom. So having independent implementations is great, and to my surprise, Keith told me that there is a professor here at Portland State that has taken their design and re-implemented it, and he's got it, but he couldn't find it to bring it in today. But
It's too small.
it's too small. Okay.
Lost it.
But I thought it was really cool. I thought I would do a shout out to Bart Macy for actually re-implementing the design. There's a lot of different ways to analyze the quality of a random number generator. Actually, the FIPS standard is pretty modest. Basically, I think is effectively telling you, is this thing alive or dead? I think we can do much better. There are a number of test suites. I'd love to hear everyone's opinion about test suites that we can use to evaluate randomness. I put test U01 up, which is one that has become very popular. Green's blog post mentions a number of other ways in which testing is tricky and needs to be thought out carefully. Obviously, that's an important thing to do. The idea, I think, is to leverage what Symtec did, the idea of connecting with the entropy key daemon and EGD, so that other applications can take advantage of the entropy pool. So that's the plan. The current status, as BDL pointed out, is we have an early prototype. We're designing the software Life kind of kept me busy too, so we're still in the design phase. I'm really keen on getting the test suites available to test not just our hardware solution for random number generation, but anyone that we might come up with. And I guess for extra credit, it'd be great if we could get these things in the archive so anyone could use them. And so I have here the URL for the project on AltusMetrum.org. It's USB TRNG. There's already an AltusMetrum IRC channel. It's on our own OFTC network, #AltusMetrum. And there's a mailing list that we've just created for this project on list.gag.com. So please come and participate. Give us your ideas. Give us your feedback. What are we going to do next? Well, we're going to continue to test the hardware, make some revisions, take your feedback, tweak it, revise it, work on the software to integrate it. Think about potential attack vectors, try to evaluate which ones are most likely, try and mitigate those kinds of attacks. Josh was telling me just at LinuxCon last week, he learned about, or he was aware of KRNGD, which is, I believe, a daemon inside the kernel or a service inside the kernel that manages entropy or provides entropy for different things like, I think, sequence numbers for networking. And I saw Tolov earlier, and I told him I was going to make this plug. I found a really interesting blog post that Tolov put out in 2009 about distributing entropy. So if we go back to this thing about, well, how many of us manage web servers or other services in the cloud that don't have the typical sources of entropy that a desktop might have, and we might not even be able to plug a USB key into them. How do we get good quality entropy into them? And so Tolov was talking about the way that he was doing that at that time, and I found that to be really interesting, including Tolov had some numbers about how much entropy was needed and how much was available and consumed. So I thought that was particularly interesting and very apropos, including some issues, and I don't know if this issue still exists, about EGD, about clients reconnecting.
I think that got fixed.
Yeah, I fixed that.
Yeah.
I fixed that about not long after. Because I think you reported the bug and I fixed it.
Yeah.
That's how that one went.
Okay, fantastic. So with that, ready to ask any questions, answer any questions that you might have. This is my blog site. I will put the slides up on my blog, tmarble.info9.net. And as I mentioned, the mailing list is list.gag.com. This is my cat Cuddles. Every presentation should have a cat. Or a rocket, or both. We got both in this one. So what do you think? Keith, do you want to say anything about Altos?
Not particularly.
Okay.
Fairly simple implementation of this for this particular project. So one of the interesting hardware hacks here was that we have a bit sequence coming out of the comparator, and we're just shoving that into a SPI input port on the processor. So it takes very little hardware overhead to actually read a stream of bits out of the sequence, and they're nicely clocked by the CPU. So we're actually able to generate. We can saturate a USB link with random numbers in theory, if we can actually generate random numbers that fast. Yeah, if they were actually random, that would be awesome. So this is a nice little USB compatible processor, the NXP LPC11U14. They're not very free software, free hardware friendly company. I would love to find a better processor, but this one costs $1.48 for an ARM processor. So that is a kind of a compelling reason to use them. I would love to switch to. And they're physically very small. I would love to switch to something with a little more free software. There's actually software in the part that runs at boot time that we don't have source to. They have a closed source development environment, which is how they try to get you to put stuff onto their part. And when somebody posted information about how to use an open source, open hardware dongle to get software onto the part on one of their fora, they actually deleted all of that data.
Oh, that's not very nice.
Yeah.
I think if you're prepared to go up to about $1.90, $2, the STM32F103 48-pin QFP was the QFP was the one that we used on the entropy key. And I have, LQFP 48? You already said that was too small. The entropy key's about, what, twice as long and the same width?
Huge.
The entropy key is about 3 times as long as the same.
Okay, right.
But it has 2 noise generators.
Yeah.
Well, that's my point.
Well, we can talk about that, but you can get a 36-pin QFN version of the STM32, and more importantly, I have an open GCC-based dev environment for it.
Oh, so do we.
Well, so do we.
It's in Debian.
And it's the 32L.
Right.
So 32F would be okay. As long as it's got USB.
Well, let me ask Toloff, let me ask you a question. How are you handling entropy these days?
It depends on which hat you're asking. If you're asking my DSA hat, we're actually still using the entropy keys because either we bought a bunch or we got a donation, I can't remember. And
You got 10 and 4, and I'll give you another 10.
yeah, stuff like that. And so yeah, we're using that. For my personal stuff, I actually don't use entropy keys at the moment, and just cope. That's as you point out, it's not a terribly good solution. So
if you had one, you might use it.
exactly. In some cases, I've used the UBHSM, which is an HSM device, which is slightly more expensive at $500. But the nice people at Ubico gave me one for free. So
That's nice.
but it also can do random number generation. So
Very good. Here.
So what I wanted to say, I not so facetiously mentioned earlier that we had thought at one point that we might just make enough of them to bring and hand them out at DebConf as sort of a getting some things into the market. But what we've really been talking about, because we have absolutely no idea how to gauge the level of actual interest from people who would actually spend money to buy one of these, is this is a classic example of something that, we ought to use the Kickstarter-ish kind of model for, one of those sites. And so my hope is that, some number of months from now, once we've had a chance to go through another, couple of hardware revs and get to something that we actually, would not be ashamed to take a little bit of money from people for, that we can do one of those crowdsourcing things and just see. Keith and I have a fairly well-oiled machine for doing small batch product, assembly. The thing that we have not tried to do is deal with what happens if we have a success disaster in one of these. And it would be an interesting learning experience actually to find all of a sudden that we needed to figure out how to build 10,000 of something. But for doing hundreds or low number of thousands, we have a pretty well-oiled process for doing that, and it's not expensive. So I think if we can get to the point where we have some kind of piece of hardware that we're happy with, turning that into something that people could actually just sort of go buy one of and use, and have it be 100% open hardware, open source is not at all difficult for us to achieve. I'll also mention in passing that our most complicated product to date, something that we call Telemega, which is a 6-pyro channel, lots and lots of sensors, flight computer. This past weekend at a launch out in Eastern Oregon, we had a chance to take a look at one that some random guy took all the design data off our site, had a couple of raw boards made, taught himself how to hand play surface mount parts at home, and got 3 working boards, one of which was flown out in Brothers, Oregon last weekend. So
Wow.
if you ever doubted the veracity of our assertion that all of our designs are 100% open hardware, open source, he actually used our bill of materials metadata to know which distributors to buy which parts from to load the board. It really is all out there. So whatever we end up with here will be in exactly that same category. And if we can end up, not having sort of little hidden binary blobs in the parts we're choosing, so much the better. But whatever we end up with, it will be completely reproducible by whoever wants to hack on them.
I think you might find it very difficult to find a microcontroller without a hidden binary blob. I think they all have a boot ROM, and you're not going to get the source for it.
The only bits that exist inside the part on the STM32L we don't ever let execute.
So, Nibe, would you be willing to say a couple of words about your project?
I will have my session. I will have my session Thursday morning.
Okay.
And that's for mainly for my GNU token, but I will also address my random number generator implementation, which is also free software and free design, free hardware design.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sure.
I've got a question concerning the SSH problem, that it started too early. Can this be fixed if I reboot the SSH daemon later, if the kernel has much more entropy?
I think so.
And then maybe this should be made a default, or
Maybe it's as easy as the system D setting.
So I thought systems tended to store some entropy on shutdown so that they could load it back up on boot.
Not trusted, it's just a mixer.
Right, okay.
From our experience, obviously, when I wrote EKD and put it together, I did a big bunch of profiling, which is actually much harder than it ought to be, because this is pre-perf and all the other nice things we can do now. But effectively, the kernel, because it uses random numbers for everything from every time the process starts, it grabs 12 bits out the pool, so it can change the stack base and do all the random placement. Every time it starts a TCP session, it goes away and creates a new session thing, and it grabs 3 bits. What I discovered is that a headless system, or a system where it's not, where there are no large-scale sources of entropy for it, often it will never ever actually get enough bits to start the system. It will never get above its minimum dole-out level. So it might get to 196 and then just give it all away, and that's the end of the message.
So when you had with the entropy key, how quickly does the entropy key become? Does the actual entropy become available to the kernel after a boot?
Well, we dump it into dev. We write it to dev random as soon as we are started. I mean, we can pull 20 kilobits a second off.
35 on the final product.
35 on the final product. So we can get 35 kilobits in a second. So, but the first 4 kilobits of that we actually physically get out. The first packet we dump straight into the kernel, and I think I set EKD to start very, very early. So it's as soon as it's run, the kernel has more than ever. The problem was we were always overfeeding the dev random pool because of this problem of figuring out who wants the entropy. So if you just send 35 kilobits a second straight into that pool at all times, there's no one will ever run out with the idea.
So I think what should be clear, it's certainly clear to me, is that just plugging a cute little piece of hardware into a USB spigot and launching EKD doesn't completely solve the problem. We have this issue of when are things being started in the system, what's the state of the entropy pool at the time various PRNGs are getting seeded and so forth. And so I would hope that maybe part of what we end up talking about as we work through sort of what we ought to do to develop this piece of hardware and have it become something lots of folks want to use is all those ancillary things of, what issues do we have in the set of sort of normally launched daemons, and should we be changing boot sequencing? Are there things that ought to be kicked sometime later? I'd love to see all of those things kind of get worked on in parallel. It's not enough to just have a piece of hardware and inject more entropy.
So I actually have no idea whether or not this has been thought about, but has anybody put any work into coming up with a standard USB protocol for these types of devices, so we can have a single driver that gets loaded immediately, fires up the USB device, don't have to worry about daemons or anything like that, and get randomness right off the bat?
You could use the existing EKD protocol if you want.
I believe one of the BSDs, I can't remember which one, actually did a kernel implementation of the EKEY protocol in order to achieve that, so that they could hold off kernel boot beyond starting the USB stack and finding an entropy key. They couldn't authenticate the key, but they could use it for sufficient entropy to get the system booted.
That's one of the things that we've been thinking about is a way for the kernel to be able to trust the key and how to do that. It's kind of tricky because, it's physically connected and it's USB and there's all these sorts of things. But, we have AES on the chip, and, there's perhaps some clever things that we can do to, secure the actual communications between the key and the kernel. But you're right, it's really going to be interesting to see, how big of a delay is it if we make certain things wait for entropy to come online. And, maybe we can profile that and get that time down.
There has actually been a little bit of interest in doing that with a special target for systemd. So, some people were saying systemd can probably solve that problem, and it can at least help a little bit with it. And the other thing is, if you use socket activation for SSH, then your SSH daemon is likely to start a bit later, which means that you actually won't run into the problem which was shown on the graph.
One thing that we did face when we did this the first time, when we put EKD out there, was there's within the sysadmin community, there's this thought that this just doesn't matter. You've produced a very good presentation with all the papers, and the majority of people who don't get it immediately will turn around to you and say, I can just use they literally just link urandom to dev random and make
if you look at the bits coming off, they look random, right?
That is exactly what they say. You don't laugh. That's exactly the result. That's exactly what you get told. So it's more of and I got told that from I'm implementing this within Debian, and I get told that a lot from you get a lot of pushback. So just be aware that when you come to do that, you're going to get it's about a political and a social thing of all bits look random until
they're not.
Until they're not.
And again, to go back to one of your comments about needing to be able to monitor and understand the quality of what you're getting off these devices, it's exceedingly hard to measure true randomness the moment you have done any processing on those bits.
Yes, that's correct.
And so within the entropy key, we had 2 generators, and we were actually doing analyses at the bit stream that was coming off each generator, the XORing of the 2 bit streams in order to do correlation analysis. Then we were doing de-biasing of the bit streams. This will be producing a very biased bit stream. There's no two ways about it. It's an electronic circuit.
You had a whitening algorithm on the chip.
So there's de-biasing to whiten. Then you have to analyze that. Then we would mix and be analyzing at that point. But the moment you start to mix, you need to switch from the algorithms designed to monitor the quality of entropy in random streams to the algorithms designed to monitor the quality of pseudo-random streams.
Yes.
Because the moment you have software performing operations on it, you're actually behaving like a pseudo-random number generator, not like a true random number generator, and that's fine. You just have to know to switch algorithms for monitoring. And FIPS 140-2 is a very weird thing because it behaves a bit like it's monitoring a true random generator, but the algorithms are keyed more towards pseudo-random generation. So on the entropy keys, we were performing the FIPS 140-2 monitoring after we were mixing things into a hashing state. So there's again, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it's really worth having 2 generators because you really need them for what you can trust.
Okay, fantastic. Steve, do you want to say something?
Yeah, as an example of how people don't get this, there is a long open bug in Launchpad that a number of us have followed up to, where there was a wishlist bug opened against the hardware RNG tools package, specifically asking people to basically plug in dev-urandom as a default. At which point, and a whole slew of people trying to chime in to explain to the person who asked for this in the first place why it was a bad idea. And we're not trying to be condescending, we're not trying to tell you you're stupid, we're trying to explain to you why this is a bad idea, no matter how expedient you think it might be at the moment. So it doesn't, if you go and get yourself a very, very quick PGP key, generation. If you're using PGP without useful randomness, you may as well not bother in the first place. But people don't get this.
That's a really good point. The education here is not trivial. I mean, yes, I suspect we're going to run into a lot of pushback.
So I think it depends. I think if you feel that it's necessary to convince everybody else out there running any kind of service that they need to care about this, then you have an incredible piece of rope to try and push. On the other hand, I have this sense that if we come up with a useful piece of hardware that generates, real entropy, and we can make it inexpensive enough, and we do the sort of cool thing of running, a Kickstarter-y kind of campaign on it, and we get sort of the right people in our extended community to go point at it and go, wow, this is cool, whether you understand it or not, you really want one of these, then it might very well be the case that, we make enough of a positive effect on sort of the community of collaborators that we really care about a lot, that it's worth doing. And not just for our own servers, but it actually makes some kind of dent out there. And whether that, eventually leads to more people understanding the problem, caring about it, I don't know. I don't know how to solve that problem. But I don't get too hung up over the fact that, not everybody's going to believe it or want it or care about it. There's certainly reasons you'd like to be able to convince people. I'd love to be able to convince certain server hardware manufacturers, for example, to think that getting this right somewhere on one of their circuit boards was the right answer. But, we'll see what can come.
I was just thinking about Tollef's case, and that he was distributing entropy to servers in a cloud, and because of this SSH problem, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. But if you decided to delay SSH start until the kernel was sure, and we trust the kernel's judgment that it has enough entropy to seed those keys, so your startup is a little bit slower when you start something up in the cloud until you get enough entropy that then SSH can be trusted. Then you could tunnel a faster entropy stream in.
There also was some work at some point to do a QEMU device, so you could actually just do this through VirtIO. I'm not entirely sure where that ended up going, but I'm sure Vince can tell us.
I believe it was Ian Moulton that was working on that.
You guys did as well?
No, Ian wrote a set of drivers for that. I don't think it ever made it all the way upstream.
Well, it got presented, and it got presented, and the QEMU people, specifically Paul, I forget his surname, sorry, and a couple of the others, basically turned around and decided, on behalf of everybody, that QEMU didn't want to be an EGD client ever. So they refused all the patches point blank, and it was at the time, certainly the word QEMU was not being developed quite as much as we might like. So I don't know whether the format of accepting things in QEMU has improved, but that's what happened to that patch series, and I tried for some time to get quite a lot of that push forward as well.
It seems to be listed in features done. So.
Okay.
So someone's taken that already from the patch series?
Yeah, I seem to remember that actually they didn't like the patch and then ended up re-implementing it completely differently, but there is some support for giving you a PCI device which is an RNG.
Right, so it's using the host's random pool. Yep.
Okay. Jimmy, do you have a question?
I was just going to respond to Bidil's point about gaining acceptance of the value of this. I was going to say that even if there's still education needed, I think that it's probably a little bit easier to make people trade, make their trade-offs in favor of security a little bit more than it was a few years ago. Now that everyone's more aware of the surveillance state, and they're at least more open to hearing the usual ways that you do security have this big flaw that you're not noticing. And so it still needs education, but the pushback volume may be a little bit more amenable to positive feedback loop overcoming it.
So I think that we're out of time. Is it-
We don't have any more talks scheduled until 4 anywhere, as far as I know.
Okay.
So you guys have lots of time, but yeah, if anyone has anything you want to do.
Are there other questions? Go ahead.
I just have a couple general crypto questions. I think I heard at one point that the Trusted Platform module has a hardware RNG built into it. Is anybody aware of that? And that's maybe a good segue to my next question is what if you have a hardware random number generator, but you want to mitigate your risk because you don't completely trust it? Is there consensus in the crypto community that mixing is enough to do that? Or?
Okay, I've got an idea. Vince has an idea. There's another one here. So who wants to go next?
Give it to Rob.
Okay.
If you have a good source of random numbers, you can mix it with something that you know is untrustworthy, and it's probably fine.
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say. I don't have any opinions about TPM. I guess.
Regardless of TPM or not, there's a mechanism within at least the Linux kernel mixing process to allow you to state when you hand over X bits of data that it only has Y amount of entropy value in it. And in fact, an EQD by default, for every 8 bits of data it hands over, only claims 7 bits of value. Therefore, if you have a random stream that you believe to be okay, you can, but it's really high speed, you could give it 4K at a time and tell it there's only 128 bits of entropy in there. And like Rob said, as long as there is some true entropy in there, a good mixing algorithm, and the Linux kernel one's pretty good. It's not the best, but it's pretty good and it's reasonably fast. Will spread that entropy out such that every bit of its possible output has been affected by every possible input entropy Shannon.
One of the things that I found in researching this was that there's an interesting, relatively newer PRNG algorithm called Fortuna that didn't make it into the kernel, and I didn't really find out why. Does anyone know? Just curious. I'd love to, learn more about that.
Fortuna is a PRNG.
Right.
So the idea is that you can top it up with some real entropy you have,
right,
and then it satisfies all your requests from that. So it's basically like devu random. The FreeBSD people and so on, they use Fortuna. I think OSX use Yarrow is the predecessor to Fortuna. Fortuna is just sort of like a tweak on it, but it is basically a PRNG that you occasionally reseed as you have data available. Whereas dev random is, I'm sure these are actually random bits.
Right. Well, I mean, if you go shopping for PRNGs, we could talk about different qualities of PRNGs. My understanding is Fortuna is probably better than earlier implementations.
It's a bit blowfish.
Blowfish? Oh, I didn't realize that.
In that regard, what about
Oh, wait, video stream.
in that regard, what about HabGED? I have that installed, but I also have an EQD that I'm mixing things in, and I don't know if anybody's looked at that one specifically, but your app get installed and you immediately have lots of entropy, but
Oh God, don't use that.
Don't use what?
Random sound.
Random sound.
Random sound. Oh.
I wrote a piece.
Well, here we are.
I've been reminded, so this is an apology. I did write a piece of software a while ago called Random Sound. It did make it into the archive. I think that was Steve Grand's fault. So everyone can blame him. Which was based around the idea that if you had an audio input that was one that you could set to be a tri-state input, then you could use the noise around that circuit as a source of entropy.
Well, just use the lower bits from the ADC and you'll be fine, right?
No. And it would produce a very high-speed stream of data, but frankly, I would trust it to be about 1 Shannon in 128 megs. And the radio one. the comment where we were all shaking our heads. The problem with anything like that is that an attacker can put a coil of wire around your input and attack it very effectively.
Well, that sort of requires physical access, though, right?
Right, but physical access is something you need to mitigate against when you have a physical device.
Indeed.
Yes, Bud. And the Bud part is just that at some point you have to decide how far you're going to go with that. I mean, anything that depends on thermal noise has, the potential of being driven very far in one direction or the other with, the application of a suitable dewar of liquid nitrogen and or a blowtorch. So I'm sorry, I'm not kidding. I mean, it really is the case that if you care about this at that level, then you do have to physically protect the devices, and you have to think about the right way to do that. And the thing about a completely open design that's reflashable is you also have to think about, the consequences of, how do you want to secure that? Is this an example of a completely open device that we ought to flip the bit on that says you can't USB reflash it? This is where Tom and I had a very serious conversation on IRC one night about, should you ever let someone other than one of the three of us have one of these devices that they can reflash over USB without having to go get a programming dongle and put it on the in-wire pins. These are interesting questions. It's not like there's a single simple answer either, but this is why I say when you start thinking about what the potential attack surface is around something that's going to be as fundamental to your sense of the security of your system as the hardware random number generator, you have to think about these things. You have to make conscious decisions. And you bloody well need to document what your thinking was so that everybody else that's looking at it and thinking about using it or doing something with it understands what they're getting. And to me, that's part of why it's so absolutely vitally important that this time around what we do ends up being something that's a completely open design that everybody can look at, everybody can think about. If somebody wants to create a better derivative of, more power to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
BDL, can't you just put like a TPM chip right here?
We will accept that perhaps we should have made it more open last time, but we don't own the intellectual property anymore. So.
Yeah, you guys don't need to apologize. In case you hadn't noticed, lots of inspiration taken from the work done on the Semtech entropy key and EKD and all those sorts of things. Mad props for...
We're going to build on it.
I actually found one to buy at LCA last January so that the ones I lost in the fire didn't leave me without. And, mad props. This is all about, what do we do now and how do we go forward? How do we make sure that this kind of stuff becomes and remains available for those of us who need it?
Did you have another comment, Rob?
I was just going to say that for the sort of attack of dipping it in liquid nitrogen or blowtorch, the entropy key had a temperature sensor, so it went, no, I'm too warm.
My numbers aren't random anymore, don't trust me.
Oh God, feature creep.
Right.
Feature creep.
It literally blew its fuses and internal fuse in my car and took the glass away. Sorry, thanks for that, bye.
It's actually reliable.
Heat was a software fuse.
Yeah.
Oh, question here. Pass that back.
Apparently the temperature sensor is so good that my colleague uses it to monitor the temperature of his house while he's working away from home.
He's welcome.
Well, we certainly didn't think of creative hacks for other sensors that we could put on the board.
He sometimes gets entropy out of it as well.
Maybe we should put a webcam on it. Oh, sorry.
Wolverine.
Oh, auto lamps are actually really good.
Any other thoughts or questions? Oh, Steve.
So I never did get round to picking up enough entropy keys for my own uses, and now it's hard. In the future, when you go into series production with these, any idea on price? What do you think you can do them for?
Pass that to the business department.
So the problem is that I've gotten very good at figuring out, based on the raw bill of materials, what I have to charge in order to be able to continue to operate a business in the high-power model rocketry world, where there's a certain flavor of customer support that we have to engage in, and there's a certain, sort of turn-on rate on the complex boards. By many measures, this is a substantially simpler piece of hardware. It is going to have a similarly complex, bench verification for each unit before I would be willing to take money from somebody. So I don't exactly know the answer. This is certainly it's in the sub $50 range US, but how much below that, I don't know. Certainly if we do a Kickstarter kind of thing, it'll be, cost plus. And then if we actually sell them for realsies after that and have to inventory them, it'll be different.
That's exactly the kind of estimate I'm looking for.
That's an entropy bench test.
Yeah, I can't imagine it. I cannot imagine asking.
Okay, I know what to look forward to.
And it'll have a pretty plastic box, too.
Will it be AltusMetrum blue?
No, because Hammond doesn't make a box in that shit.
White or black, which is your choice?
Well, that is unless we can get Jeff to find us that color in the right spool for the printer. But
Print your own case. You could print a nice Debian scroll out of it.
That would be wonderful.
okay, I think we're about done.
We're done.
If we're talking about 3D printing swirls, we're done.
Thank you, everyone.